Let's start, I suppose, with human-centered approach. I touched on it earlier, right? Like as human, like it's people at the other end that you're dealing with, right? Like job seekers particularly, it can be such a daunting and like sometimes very long process for somebody, and just making them feel like they're a human being at the other end, I think is really important, especially in this day and age when we're really moving towards tech, right? Like how do we really optimize and think about how we can make that more as humanized as possible?
Welcome to Offer Accepted, the podcast that elevates your recruiting game. I'm your host, Shannon Ogborn. Join us for conversations with talent leaders, executives, and more to uncover the secrets to building and leading successful talent acquisition teams. Gain valuable insights and actionable advice from analyzing cutting-edge metrics to confidently claiming your seat at the table. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Offer Accepted. I'm your host, Shannon Ogborn, and this episode is brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform empowering ambitious teams from seed to IPO and beyond. I could not be more excited because I'm here today with Selcan Sengul. She is the Senior Director of Talent and People Operations at Taxfix, and she leads both hiring and employee experiences for the company. She's really passionate advocate for equity and inclusion at every stage of the employee journey as well. She is a dedicated leader in recruitment and people functions, creating thoughtful, human-centered candidate experiences, which we're going to get a lot to today. She spent her career helping teams at both big tech companies like Meta and fast-scaling startups delivering authentic and memorable experiences for candidates. She believes strongly that every touchpoint with a candidate, even a rejection, is an opportunity to foster engagement and connection. Selcan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shannon. I'm excited to be here today.
Amazing. You have so much great experience, and I'm really excited to get to the results you all have seen from implementing thoughtful rejection templates. But first, wanted to understand from you on what candidate experience means to you and why is it so important?
Yeah, sure. I think candidate experience it's more than just recruitment, right? Like it really is a lot about trust. It's about equity, belonging. Every candidate is could be a potential customer, especially if you're in a B2C organization, but just in general, I think any candidate's always open to be a customer. They're also ambassadors to our brands. If we think about lots of different websites like Glassdoor, LinkedIn, all these different channels, potential candidates and applicants are even looking at these before they've even submitted any applications anywhere, right? So it's super important that we're creating a lasting candidate experience for everybody so that they can be ambassadors for our brand too. They can be potential teammates down the line. They can refer people. It's really important that as companies, we take a lot of responsibility ensuring that we treat every person with a lot of dignity. It's also the starting and focal point for inclusion, right? So if we think about companies, like if you're a really truly inclusive company, it's a perfect opportunity to be able to show your values and your commitment that way. It's a really big, important focus touch point for us as well in terms of our culture. And, you touched on rejections as well. If we think about the whole hiring cycle, like candidate experience really touches along every single touch point in that journey, right from the application to the rejection. So, I think if I was to sum it up, I would say it's, making sure that you're being really thoughtful, clear, humanizing every opportunity that you can get. I always say like hiring metrics are always so important in recruiting. Candidate experience is just another one of those things that we look at in that whole kind of suite of KPIs and metrics. And we shouldn't make it feel like it's that, although it has an impact, it shouldn't just be another metric that we look at when we make that feeling kind of come through on the other end. So yeah, it's really important that we're building that community with the people that we're engaging with, potential candidates or future customers.
100%. I think the important thing to remember with candidate experience, and of course, there's all the places you said, there's Glassdoor. Now, a lot of candidates are taking to LinkedIn to share their thoughts on a experience, good, bad, and ugly. This concept came from marketing. There's social, which is what people put on public networks, Glassdoor, LinkedIn, and things like that. But then there's also the concept of dark social, where for every person who says something publicly, there's many more people who say something privately to their friend, like, hey, I had this really great experience with Taxfix. And if someone sees a job there and they go to apply there, they already have a positive impression. And the inverse can be true as well. If my best friend is interviewing somewhere and sends me a message and is like, I cannot believe how bad of experience I had at XYZ company, I'm like, I would think twice for infinity to even apply there, let alone take a job.
For sure. I agree, Shannon. There is a lot of that. And people do. You're obviously sharing with your friends and family your experiences that you have. So absolutely second that.
Amazing. Well, I know that Taxfix has a lot of things that emulate the candidate experience and enhancing the candidate experience. Can you tell me how candidate experience has resonated at Taxfix?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, there's so many several areas that I could kind of touch upon. And, when we think of the full cycle, but I think about the topics that we're talking about today, there's a couple that particularly stand out for me, and they'd be really very much in the early stages of the process. So, if I was to pick two or three, I'd say really strong kickoffs, and I'll talk about these in a second, but I'd say like really strong kickoffs, really clear, strong job descriptions. And then, we can touch on kind of templates in a second as well. I'll focus on these areas. But if we think about kickoff, I mean, I don't think we should underestimate really the importance of the kickoff and, the key stakeholders that need to be in there. If you've sourcers, coordinators, schedulers, ops, key people that can kind of contribute, whatever your hiring process looks like, I think it's really important to consider the role of each of the person there. But the job descriptions also tie very much into that. You want to make sure that you've got a very clear job description before you even go into those kickoffs, so you've got a solid foundation to start that discussion from. But the kickoffs for me really define what the rest of that process is going to look like. You're thinking about who's going to be on your panels, what's your process going to look like. And the reason all those things are so important is because if you're thinking about candidate experience and that first touch point a sourcer or a recruiter has with that candidate, we think about transparency and we think about that overall experience. You want to be able to message as much as you can with those candidates in that first touch point. And that's why the kickoff is such a significant and important step of the process. But it also, we've got documents that we use, and we have a very clear kind of structure around things that we want to get covered in those kickoffs, like some of the things I mentioned. But I also don't think it should be a static process. Like it often changes, right? So you should always be revisiting those and kind of adding new things. For example, like over the last 2 years, actually, we've been putting a huge kind of emphasis around our DEI and our DEI practices. And that was one of the areas that wasn't as apparent kind of in all of our kickoff conversations, right? So we've been driving a lot of initiatives. We've set different strategies and OKRs on different things we're doing there. And they're one of the things that was missing kind of in our kickoff conversations. So in order to make sure we were aligning to the goals and the strategy of what we're driving there, we've looked at kind of where are those areas. So that's what I mean by always kind of revisiting and making sure that you're kind of optimizing for those. And like job descriptions, again, I'm sure lots of people are already doing this, but just making sure that you're minimizing for bias. You've inclusive language in there. You're making sure that it's really accessible to all kind of types of backgrounds and individuals, that come close or meet the criteria of the roles. So again, kind of reviewing those with the hiring manager and calling out where there may be potential gaps. A couple of things that we've updated in on our careers page. We weren't kind of highlighting some of the things that we do around accessibility, for example. I mean, it's something so small, but it's so impactful, right? Like to be able to kind of show people that you're thinking about those things. So every company will have their own areas. And then templates. I mean, templates are a huge piece, Shannon, that I think like that people can underestimate. Again, we implemented that. We had templates, but quite very basic ones, right? So a lot of our recruiters were often kind of taking the template and then they were still kind of writing every single one was kind of like writing a different message. So we kind of sat down and kind of made a project plan around it, and we wanted to kind of revamp all of our templates and kind of look at where we could optimize for opportunities to drive kind of a better candidate experience. So they'd be the three areas I think that have been big kind of focus areas for us out of the several steps that I can just kind of do an initial intro into.
Amazing. I think all of these fall under the category for me of pre-work makes the dream work, because all of these things, if you get them right at the jump, everything else is going to fall into place so much better. And it's not even fall into place, right? It's intentional. You've done all of the work, but it feels like it's falling into place because you've done the pre-work. It is the best outcome for everybody if you can get it right at the start.
Yeah. And like if we link it back to even candidate experience as well, we've just been talking a lot about the brand, the engagement, the trust. Like, yeah, it's not really a nice, it's a nice to have that we have to kind of do these things. So
For sure. Well, you had mentioned stuff about templates, and we had previously specifically talked about rejection templates. I think why this is so important today is there's efficiency problems with all of the candidates that are applying today. We have done some trends reports at Ashby that indicate so many more applications are coming in inbound than ever before. And so there's these problem statements that are macro But then there's obviously the problem statements that are unique to the organization. So I'd love to hear, what have you implemented in this area and how did the idea come about?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that kind of impacted it. We've gone through a lot of change over the last 2 years in our company, various different kind of org changes, just different changes in the company. And as a result, it's sometimes given us resource constraints. Sometimes it's given new people coming in that have needed to be trained up on hiring practices. So there's been various different things that have impacted just operational workflows, I would say. And again, kind of looking at our metrics, we were seeing, certain dips in our NPS scores from candidates during that period of time. And we felt that it was an important time to kind of look at how do we kind of keep driving efficiencies, but also improve our candidate experience scores. So we felt that templates was something that we needed. I mean, I mentioned it earlier, but it was one of the areas we really needed to focus in on to help with driving efficiency, given we were having some of these constraints, So we were looking at how can we best optimize, how can we get more efficient with our time. When I think about the templates, we've put in different kind of templates at rejection stages. So each of our stages in the hiring process have templates mapped to those. And there's quite a body of work that needs to go into that at the forefront, right? But I think it's time really well spent when we think about the feedback we've been getting from our recruiters around productivity. We've looked at our time to hire. That's come down as a result. Recruiters are more positive in the teams because they're spending less time kind of texting and writing back and just kind of really filling in where they need to. I think one particular standout change that we've seen and it positively impacted our NPS scores as well was a template that we put in at the start of the process. So when candidates, I mean, you touched on the fact that you're getting multiple, like hundreds of applications coming through, and to be able to kind of best manage through those, but still make it a very human and personalized approach for people. We actually started adding in things like what we look at when we're evaluating CVs at Taxfix, for example, like what are the type of things that we look for on people's CVs. And, we call out specifically that that's not the reason that they would have been declined in that specific instance, but we give them different resources. We give them different tips that they could maybe do to kind of update their CV. And look, you get mixed messaging, right? Like I think it's generally been quite positive for us, but you will still have individuals that, may not have necessarily read the template in detail, or they may have kind of missed certain things. And actually we had a really good discussion about this the other day where it was like, okay, maybe it's time to kind of revisit that. Let's do some more A/B testing and let's actually apply some of those changes. If people are being like appreciating this, how can we change again, right? So it's not just saying, okay, we've done the template, it's done now. I think it's just constantly looking at that feedback, I think is super important as well. But our NPS scores did start improving, I think, as a result of having the template so that recruiters were becoming more efficient and everyone was kind of getting responses in more of a timely fashion, more transparency, more clarity. It was on each touch point, but also that, we were going that extra mile and kind of giving something back when we were actually declining them. So it felt like a bit more of a human approach.
Something else you said about consistency and messaging, that's so important because your brand is hinging on individuals evangelizing your brand and being the face of your brand, and recruiting is the face of a brand. They are oftentimes the first interaction somebody has with your company or your brand. And so having that consistency in messaging means that if there is a problem, you're able to fix it across, because once it starts getting into the individualized, everyone is saying something completely different, that can actually have a huge impact on how people perceive your brand, and they might actually be incorrectly perceiving it.
Exactly. And or, one person's getting one experience by one person and then another person's getting another experience. And then when they start in the company, it's even things like, oh, my process wasn't like that, or your process wasn't like this. But even, at the rejection stage, everybody kind of knows each other as well, right? So like, depending on whatever stage you're at, I think that consistency is really important. I agree.
I know that people, like you said, sometimes whatever messaging you put out is just never going to be what somebody wants to hear. It's hard though when you feel like you're just doing everything for a candidate and you still get the negative feedback. As a highly sensitive person, that impacts me heavily, but maybe not everybody.
No, I know that's always a really difficult one, actually, Shannon. I do agree with you on that, right? Because like that, there's a policy sometimes at companies where you don't give it, but the recruiter in you and the candidate experience in you wants to still do it, like even if it's a small bit. Yeah, I think if you do it or you don't do it, like either way, and it always comes back to the person again. Like when people are effectively your product of the company, of what you're doing in your day to day, right? Like everybody is different. So you necessarily don't know how someone's going to respond in that scenario. All you can do is your best as a recruiter, right? And try and aim for your best approach that you can give.
Absolutely. Well, that's kind of the obstacle on the candidate side. Would love to hear what obstacles presented themselves maybe internally as you were building out these rejection templates.
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, I think rejection templates, like in nature, it's automation, like no matter how much you try and personalize it, it's still automation. So you want to try and ensure that there is definitely that element of some personalization in there for recruiters or whoever's sending it, so it doesn't sound like overly robotic. So I think that was definitely one thing we had to really think through around, like the tone, how we wanted to speak. Also, we've been doing a lot of work this year around EVP at the company and culture, and how do we want to translate that through into messaging. So I think it's important that you think about those things in terms of how you want to communicate back out as well. So that was definitely, balancing the personalization with the outcome of the speed and efficiency that we were looking for was definitely one thing. The adoption and the consistency as well. I think, like, it's managing change among recruiting teams, right? So like anything, people can always default to what they're used to. Like there's a journey in through making sure that you're trying to get the best adoption and usage of them. So the ways we, I suppose, looked at that was we involved all of our recruitment team in crafting all of those templates and consistently bringing it back up in meetings and one-to-ones around, like, how are they working for you. So we're kind of keeping it at the forefront, but they were kind of very much involved in kind of helping us build those, and we continue to look at the feedback loops. But I would say they're the two really big ones, right? If we're thinking about kind of the crafting, it's like that there's the change management part and balancing the personalization and the speed of it as well.
Some burning questions for me came up. Just kind of logistically, did you guys have to think about what your rejection reasons were before you built the templates? Like, was there any other work tangential that went into this? It's kind of like a house project. You start ripping out the kitchen and then you realize that you actually need to like redo the whole plumbing.
Yes, and we still are. I mean, it's constantly an iterative process. Yes, and I think for us as well, like, we were in the middle of a migration with our ATS this year as well, right? So I think it was a perfect opportunity for some of those. So, but yeah, we've been looking at our processes. I think if I think about, like, some of the specific areas that came up, I mean, obviously the MPS kind of highlighted the resourcing issue and the dip in the metrics there. We kind of implemented at that stage, especially on the scheduling and the candidate automation side. We built a lot of templates in there specifically, which we hadn't previously thought about or identified, right? Like, we thought, okay, here's another opportunity where we often get lots of questions coming back. So based on these questions that we're getting back, actually, we can reintroduce kind of templates that can do these. So it really comes back, Shannon, to, like, when you're having your weekly meetings or you're having your one-to-ones and feedback comes in, and it's like, oh, okay, like, having it at the forefront around how you can constantly be optimizing it. But I would say, like, the two very distinct areas were particularly around that initial touch point from candidates, because we were just getting, like, huge volume, particularly around the scheduling, because our operations team is quite lean as well, right? So I think there's massive opportunity to do some automations there as well. So that, like, for example, like, every time a candidate moves through to a next stage, we have a small automation in there again, that, like, or like a template where a recruiter can kind of personalize some of those. So we distinguished which ones we wanted to have as a standard automated response, and then which ones we wanted to personalize. So, if they're moving through to the next stage at a hiring manager, for example, you might want to personalize that. But if it's confirmation from a scheduling a change or a scheduling that they've done or an interview that they booked, then that can be probably a little bit more standard with the details that they're looking for. So we did have to try and identify exactly which templates kind of we used and what format we used as we were going through the process.
One of my last questions here, and I don't mean to put you on the spot with this, but I'm so curious if there was any rejection messaging that has really resonated or you found actually really didn't resonate and you're like, okay, we gotta get this out of here.
Like, I think the only one that was probably the one that I mentioned a little bit earlier on, right? Like that, where people felt, a particular individual felt that, you're giving me tips on CVs, like, my CV's fine. There's nothing wrong with my kind of CV, right? So, which was another reason for us to kind of be like, okay, let's kind of see how we can rephrase some of this. Like, we don't want to be making people feel like they're potentially seeing it as an insult as well, right? So we often go into these with best intentions, with the hope that we're going to solve for something. It's going to help us improve, but it's also going to help from a candidate experience perspective. But sometimes, we misjudge that too, right? So I think it's important that you take on board that feedback to see, could I have changed the wording? Like, for us, it's like, actually, we could probably tweak our wording a little bit. If our perception is that they're not reading that message, or maybe they're not getting to that bit and they're not understanding it because they're scanning the message, we should try and change our wording a little bit. That could help with that. So I think that was definitely a clear moment for us where we just assumed people would love this, but then people could take it as an insult too, right? So yeah, that's the only thing that I can think of. But otherwise, it's actually landed quite well. The sentiment is generally quite positive.
That's great. I love that.
Yeah.
You had mentioned some of the results earlier, but curious if there were any other results on candidate experience or other metrics since you started doing this that you wanted to highlight.
Yeah, look, I mean, I touched on kind of time to hire and time to fill, of course, and our MPS. I think one of the other ones is like we saw some greater engagement in some of our external channels as well. We're doing a lot at the moment around just building our brand as a company too, right? So regularly looking at our LinkedIn engagement, our Glassdoor, etc., and we saw positive upward trends across engagement on both those areas. Our scores went up considerably in a few months after we implemented some of these things. We've also seen quite a few kind of increased conversion ratios overall, which kind of is a knock-on effect, right, on your time to fill. So I'm not talking about just rejection templates here, but just generally templates, right, and the usage of templates. It has a knock-on effect on your overall conversion ratios through the whole funnel. So I think that's definitely areas where we've seen quite a bit of impact with the results.
That's amazing. All of these things are so intertwined. It can definitely feel overwhelming if you are in talent where you don't really know where to start because everything has an impact on everything else. But I think this idea of templatizing what you can so that you can move faster. And I feel like there's no really better time to do this than when you're planning for your next round of hiring and you're like, okay, let's get it all together. Let's get everything we need so that when we unleash our big hiring plan, you can just sprint at it instead of having to stop. And when you have to stop and send a fully personalized rejection, that is a lot of work. That's adding minutes and maybe even hours a week to your workload.
Exactly, which adds up over time.
Definitely. Well, taking a big step back, and we always love to hear from our offer accepted guests. When you hear hiring excellence, what does that mean to you?
Wow, it's like a huge amount of stuff, right? I mean, I could talk for hours here. Let's start, I suppose, with human-centered approach. I touched on it earlier, right? Like as human, like it's people at the other end that you're dealing with, right? Like job seekers particularly, it can be such a daunting and like sometimes very long process for somebody, and just making them feel like they're a human being at the other end, I think is really important, especially in this day and age when we're really moving towards tech, right? Like how do we really optimize and think about how we can make that more as humanized as possible? I think the alignment and the clarity from the start is going to be really, we touched on it again, as I said, right? Like the start stages, like that's so important in terms of how you execute your whole process. So I think that alignment and clarity is really important. And actually making even the tough calls sometimes around pausing starting the job. Like oftentimes hiring managers can be like, let's kick off, let's get going. And, I've definitely been on the end of that where I've said, okay, let's go. You get caught up in that we just need to like deliver. But actually sometimes it always ends up that you're going back and you're rewriting the job description or you're redoing everything. So yeah, just being really true to the fact that alignment is important. I think it's important to balance the speed with the quality, right? Like I think especially in scale ups and startups, even large organizations where like you get projects out of just nowhere where you're not expecting it and it's like suddenly right go. It's important that we're not forgetting about the qualitative aspect of it, and inclusion is super important, keeping that your DEI practices and making sure that we're being super inclusive and fair, really fair. The fairness part I think is really important because bias creeps in, and I think it's our jobs as recruiters and recruiting teams to make sure we're at the forefront of that, right? So I think it's really important that we're constantly reminding hiring teams about that and each other, like within our TA functions as well. The transparency is another big one, being as transparent as possible with candidates, keeping in touch with them regularly, communication, keep your lines of communication open all the time. And also you're measuring your impact. I think the metrics play a really important part in terms of progress. Without your metrics, you can't really define where you need to be improving on. You can't see where you need to make improvements. So I think the metrics play a really, really key role. I think it's just important that it doesn't get so the other way that you're almost forgetting about the quality, right? So they serve a very important role and purpose that you kind of have to measure through it. So I'd say they're the main things that for me, that like, I mean, there's a lot there, but I think they're very important ones.
Yeah, I think that the talent function is one of the most delicate balances to strike in a business. There's just so much gray area that you have to operate around because, like you said, the humans are what you're working with, and humans, there's a lot of gray area with working person to person, but it's a person to person role and a person to person business. So I love all of those. I think that's a very thoughtful answer to what hiring excellence is. Well, we are at our last question, and I'm very excited to hear what is your recruiting hot take?
Oh, my recruiting hot take. Okay, so I have seen a lot of conversation lately, actually, on LinkedIn around. You may have seen it yourself, Shannon, just around people kind of talking about the ex companies that they've worked at in their titles. It's really actually interesting to watch the flow of the conversations from people that are coming in. You mentioned this earlier, like even people come in and comment on these different social channels, and there's a lot of debate at the moment around, whether you should, whether you shouldn't kind of add it in. I think for me, I'm definitely on the side where I think it can serve a purpose. I'll be getting all the comments now, but look, I think if I think about individuals that do add these in, and I've put it in, right? Like I put it in when I've been doing my job search too. If we think about LinkedIn as a platform, like it's currently the number one platform for all of our recruiting professionals, like searching for talent online. A lot of activity is happening there. It's the professional network where everybody goes to job search and kind of share opportunities and network and kind of be visible. And if I think about the companies that a number of people are adding here, they're companies that have become huge brands, and they've become huge brands for different reasons, right? Like, so they've got different ways of operating. They've all started somewhere small where maybe the way they operated wasn't perfect. Not that everything they do now is perfect either, right? But there's definitely certain standards that they operate to. And I think that, when people work at these organizations, they're contributing to that and they're feeling proud that they've contributed to that. I mean, if you think about companies that are selling products, they're often saying that they use these companies, or these companies are customers of them. So, why can't kind of individual people, I suppose? But yeah, I think for me that's a piece that I would say it's not really about bragging. I think there's a sentiment out there that people are bragging about, working at this company or that company. For me, it's not about bragging. For me, it's they've felt proud to work at whichever that company is, whatever sector that is. And and they want to talk about their impact. And if we think about like recruiting, the role of the recruiter, right, in searching for these people, or people in general, right, like to fill their roles, they look to these sometimes because of those very specific things that they might have gained skills in, right? Or they have a very specific way of working. It's just, it's important to kind of keep that front of mind. Yeah. So I think, they would be kind of the main things I would say. That's definitely probably a little bit of a controversial hot take, but there's a lot of debate. So I thought it could be a good one to kind of share my focus and opinion on.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting conversation going on with that. My personal take on it is that I have no problems if people put that in their headline. As a job seeker, though, I have given the advice to people who are, especially people who are looking for jobs, don't put that ahead of the type of role that you're looking for. So, in the LinkedIn headline, when you can say, you can put whatever you want, right? And so I always recommend people will say, let's just say account executive, X Meta, X Google, X whatever. Because if I'm scrolling and I see you're hiring or you're looking for work banner, and all I see in your headline is XXXX, I don't know what you do. I don't know what you're looking for. I don't know how to help. And so that's my main piece of feedback. It's not really, for me, it's not really about having it there. Just don't prioritize it over your actual function. Otherwise, I feel like it's actually harder to help you.
Yes. Yes. No, I definitely agree with that. I think each of those things, like, I think they all serve purposes. It's really about kind of putting yourself out there for recruiters that might be searching for that very specific thing. And some people choose to leave it off. But that's a very good tip, Shannon. I think coupled with the two of those, I think it sets people up to be discovered on the huge platform.
Yeah, totally. But it's like for job seekers specifically, I was like, just put your marketing hat on. Your role in your job search is to persuade people to find you through searching, interview you, and hire you. And so, how can you put your best foot forward as a job seeker and showcase your marketability. Like, I know that it feels very, for some people, especially people who've been looking for jobs for a long time, it feels frustrating and it's like, I hate this game. But I'm sorry to say, in a way, a game it kind of is. And the more you can set yourself up for success, the better the results will be.
Yeah, for sure. And like, let's not underestimate either. Again, I say this, that like all these organizations, I mean, it's the first step to identify talent, right? If you're proactively searching, every company should still run a very thorough process, and they will. It doesn't mean that just because, you're finding these talent that they're the best for your environment, right? Like, just because they've come from those organizations and may have the type of skills you look for, doesn't make them perfect for what you're looking for either, right? It's just another search toolkit for many recruiters out there, and it's a toolkit for applicants, right? So I think that's the way, I look at it anyway, but I know there's a lot of very differing opinions on the topic.
For sure. And I think regardless, it's similar to the open to work thing. As talent people, our jobs aren't actually really to judge, it's to find the best talent. And you can't really mistake the two. If you're going to be judgmental about someone who has open to work, even as a hiring manager, you're going to be judgmental about someone who has open to work or does or doesn't have X FANG company on their profile, you're just going to miss out on talent. And so the more that we can reduce those judgments and focus eyes on the prize, finding the best talent and the best match for your team, the better off we'll be.
Completely agree.
Well, I think we are coming up on our time. Where should people go to learn more about you and Taxfix?
Yeah, I mean, look, LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. We just talked about it. Anyone can kind of find me there. We have a Taxfix page there as well, if you're interested in hearing a little bit more there as well. And obviously taxfix.com. You can find out a little bit more about our company there too.
Amazing. Well, Selcan, I cannot thank you enough for joining us on Offer Accepted. I really appreciate you spending some time with us, and I know folks will get great value out of your insights. So thank you again.
Thank you, Shannon. It's been lovely.
This episode was brought to you by Ashby. What an ATS should be. A scalable, all-in-one tool that combines powerful analytics with your ATS, scheduling, sourcing, and CRM. To never miss an episode, subscribe to our newsletter at www.ashbyhq.com/podcast. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.